Florence, 1519. A city of marble palaces and merchant banks where gold and silk flowed through narrow streets and the whispers of rivalry echoed louder than church bells. It was here that a child was born into one of the most powerful families of Renaissance Europe. But this child's arrival was not greeted with joy. For many in Florence, the infant Catherine was not a blessing, but a burden. A fragile heir carrying the shadow of a name feared as much as it was admired, Medici. Within days of her birth, Catherine's world collapsed. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, died from syphilis. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, succumbed to complications of childbirth. Orphaned before she could even open her eyes to the world, Catherine entered life already marked by tragedy. Florentines saw in her story something more than coincidence. To them, it was a curse. In medieval and Renaissance cultures, early death and misfortune in dynasties were read as signs of divine punishment. And for the Medici, whose wealth had often outpaced their virtue, Catherine's lonely crib was taken by some as proof that heaven had turned against them. This was no ordinary family. The Medici were bankers, patrons, and political masters, weaving themselves into the fabric of Europe's power. Catherine's great-grandfather was Lorenzo the Magnificent, the man who had funded artists like Michelangelo and Botticelli, yet ruled Florence like a prince, cloaked in velvet and poetry. But Florence, unlike kingdoms, was a republic at heart, and many citizens resented Medici dominance. To be born a Medici in 1519 was not to inherit comfort, but to inherit enemies. The idea of cursed heirs is an old one. In Egypt, the boy king Tutankhamun, frail and sickly, was said to embody the punishment of gods against a dynasty that had defied tradition. In Rome, whispers followed the Julio-Claudian children, seen as symbols of dynastic excess. Anthropology teaches us that societies often project their fears onto children of power. They become vessels for the hopes or anxieties of the community. Catherine's infancy fit this pattern. She was seen less as a child and more as a living emblem of Florence's fractured destiny. Her early life unfolded during one of Florence's most unstable eras. Just 8 years earlier, in 1512, the Medici had been restored to power after years of Republican rule. But Florence's Republican tradition was resilient. In the streets, guild leaders, merchants, and reformers plotted to push back against the family's influence. Catherine was too young to understand, but the air around her was charged with unrest. When she was just 8 years old, rebellion erupted. The Medici were expelled once more, and Florence declared itself a republic again. In their fury, rebels debated what to do with the young girl left behind. Some suggested Catherine should be paraded as a puppet. Others whispered she should be executed to erase the Medici line entirely. For a time, her fate hung by a thread. She was placed in convents, cloistered behind walls not for safety, but as a hostage. These were not peaceful years of prayer and Latin hymns. During the 1529 siege of Florence, the convent where Catherine stayed was caught in the violence. Accounts describe rebels surrounding her sanctuary, threatening to throw her into the streets. Imagine a child of 10 hearing chants of hatred outside, unsure if the next moment would bring salvation or slaughter. Later legends claimed she watched flames and heard cannon fire from her window, her survival etched into her memory as proof of destiny. History is often written with hindsight, but in those years Catherine's survival was not guaranteed. Many powerful heirs of Europe, boys and girls alike, did not live to adulthood. Some were eliminated by rivals, others by illness or misfortune. Catherine's persistence through siege and political chaos gave her a reputation early on, a child spared by fate. In mythological terms, she echoed the archetype of the orphan survivor, like Romulus and Remus, nourished by a she-wolf, or Moses, floating in his basket upon the Nile. Stories of abandoned or endangered children who lived to change nations are common across civilizations. Florence, whether consciously or not, was writing such a story around Catherine. Her lineage amplified her importance. Through her mother, she was linked to French nobility. Through her father, to the wealth and ambition of Florence. This dual inheritance made her a glittering prize in the eyes of rulers across Europe. Papal Rome, Imperial Spain, and the French crown all watched her closely. She was valuable not for who she was, but for what she represented, the continuation of a bloodline that could be leveraged in marriage alliances. Behind these political calculations, Catherine herself grew in the convent walls. Sources suggest she received an unusually thorough education for a girl of her time: mathematics, astrology, medicine, and languages. Florentine tradition placed value on broad learning, even for women destined for arranged marriages. The Medici were patrons not only of art, but of knowledge, and Catherine's mind became her quiet refuge. Later in life, this education would prove her greatest weapon. The orphan years also shaped her psychology. Jungian archetypes describe the orphan not as weak, but as someone who learns to navigate a hostile world by observation. Catherine learned early to listen more than speak, to remember slights, and to understand that survival meant adaptation. While her childhood was marked by powerlessness, it was also her training ground for the strategies that would one day make her formidable. By 1530, Florence fell once more, this time to imperial troops loyal to the Medici Pope Clement VII. Catherine was restored to Medici control, spared execution, and soon brought to Rome. But the trauma of near death and abandonment had left an indelible mark. She had survived Florence's hatred, not through protection, but through patience and luck. The image of Catherine as a cursed child would linger in memory. Protestant writers of the 16th century later used her early misfortunes to frame her as destined for wickedness, the Black Queen, whose childhood shadows explained her later ruthlessness. But modern historiography suggests a different view. Catherine's survival was not evidence of a curse, but of resilience. From the start, her life was shaped by forces beyond her control: plague, war, rebellion, and dynastic vendetta. And yet she endured. Like the ancient stories of orphans who rose from obscurity, Catherine carried the lessons of survival with her into adulthood. Where others saw fragility, she carried memory. Where others saw curse, she learned strategy. And in time, that strategy would carry her not just into the courts of France, but into the heart of power itself. Siege and survival. Childhood under threat. By the time Catherine reached the age of 8, Florence was once again in flames. The Republic, restless and resentful of Medici dominance, had risen against her family. The year was 1527, and the city declared itself free of Medici rule. For Catherine, who had already lost her parents and lived under the shadow of her name, this rebellion was not an abstract quarrel of statesmen. It was a matter of life and death. The rebels saw her not as a child, but as a symbol. She was the last legitimate heir of the main Medici line, a living reminder of the family they despised. To execute her would be to strike a symbolic blow against Medici power. Some factions openly argued that the girl should be paraded through the streets as an emblem of tyranny, then destroyed. Others, fearing the wrath of the Pope, suggested she be kept alive, but confined, a hostage of Florence itself. Her guardians placed her in convents for protection, but even holy walls could not shield her from politics. Catherine lived first in Santa Lucia, then Santa Caterina, and later in Le Murate, a fortified convent that became her prison. These were not gentle retreats for prayer. The nuns themselves were divided in loyalty, and rumors swirled outside the walls that the child might be handed over to the mob. In 1529, when imperial armies marched to restore Medici power, Florence dug in for resistance. The siege of Florence was brutal. Cannons roared against the city's walls, food grew scarce, and disease spread among the defenders. Catherine, only 10 years old, was caught in this storm. Her convent was surrounded by soldiers, its gates battered, its windows rattled by bombardment. Later stories claimed rebels threatened to drag her into the streets as a shield against Medici vengeance. For weeks she lived with the sound of war echoing in the cloisters, hymns sung by nuns drowned out by the crash of artillery. This childhood under siege was not unique in Europe's violent Renaissance. Children of ruling families often became bargaining chips or collateral damage in the struggles of men. In Byzantium, the sons of emperors were blinded to prevent their claim to the throne. In England, the Wars of the Roses saw royal heirs imprisoned and executed for dynastic advantage. Anthropology shows us a consistent pattern. The children of power are rarely allowed innocence. They become symbols before they can speak, pawns before they can play. Catherine was no exception. Yet there is something remarkable about her survival. Surrounded by threats, she developed the habit of endurance. Accounts suggest she adapted to convent life with discipline, learning the routines of prayer, reading, and silence. She absorbed Latin, studied scripture, and practiced the rituals of devotion. At the same time, she was learning an unspoken lesson. Survival often required invisibility. By blending into her environment, by appearing pious and unthreatening, she lessened the chances of being singled out. The psychological impact of these years cannot be overstated. Depth psychology tells us that early trauma often forges archetypes within the personality. For Catherine, the archetype of the survivor was etched into her being. Where others broke, she observed. Where others despaired, she adapted. Later in life, critics would call her cold or calculating, but perhaps she was simply carrying forward the lessons learned as a child. Emotions must be hidden, intentions concealed, and survival purchased through patience. In 1530, after nearly 3 years of turmoil, the siege ended. Imperial forces loyal to her Medici uncle, Pope Clement VII, broke through. Florence was starved and exhausted, forced to surrender. The Medici returned to power, and Catherine's life was spared. But she emerged from the ordeal changed. She was still only 11, yet she had lived through political purges, religious strife, and the daily terror of death. Unlike other noble children raised in luxury, Catherine's formative memories were not of feasts and finery, but of hunger, fear, and confinement. Some historians argue that this period explains her later reputation for caution. Unlike monarchs who assumed power was their birthright, Catherine understood that authority was fragile. She had seen mobs threaten her life before she was even a teenager. She had learned that thrones were built on shifting ground, and that survival depended not on strength alone, but on strategy. There is also a symbolic layer here. Renaissance Europe was steeped in astrology and prophecy, and many later writers interpreted Catherine's childhood as an omen. To live through a siege and emerge alive was to be marked by destiny. Chroniclers painted her as chosen, her survival proof that she was meant for something extraordinary. Though whether that destiny was divine blessing or infernal curse depended on the writer's allegiance. Protestant pamphleteers later twisted these memories into proof that she was a demon child, spared only to wreak havoc on Christendom. Catholic allies, meanwhile, saw her endurance as a sign of God's favor. This is where historiography matters. The stories told about Catherine were not neutral, they were weapons. To her enemies, her childhood became evidence of her monstrous nature. To her defenders, proof of her resilience. The truth, likely, lies in between. A young girl, frightened and alone, who learned that survival required silence, patience, and a memory sharp enough to keep account of every slight. Florence itself carried scars from this siege. Its republican dream had been crushed, its citizens punished, its autonomy compromised by imperial rule. Archaeology of the city still reveals the fortifications hastily erected during those desperate years, silent reminders of the turmoil Catherine lived through. In a way, Florence and Catherine shared a fate. Both had been besieged, both had been forced to submit, and both would carry the memory of loss into the future. It is also worth noting how Catherine's convent years connected her to a wider European tradition of women shaped in religious enclosures. Many powerful queens and noble women of the Middle Ages and Renaissance were educated in convents, where they encountered both discipline and intellectual training. The cloister could be prison and school at once. For Catherine, it was also crucible. By the time she left Florence for Rome, restored to Medici custody, she was no longer just an orphaned girl. She was a survivor who had watched cities burn, heard crowds call for her death, and lived under the shadow of political hatred. These experiences carved into her a determination few could match. Later, when she entered the French court as a teenage bride, she was mocked for her plain looks, her Italian habits, and her awkwardness. What her critics did not understand was that Catherine carried with her a kind of armor invisible to the eye. She had lived through fire before, and she knew how to wait until the flames passed. In the end, the siege of Florence gave Catherine more than trauma. It gave her a template for survival. In politics, as in childhood, she learned that the ones who endure are not always the strongest, but the most adaptable. And adaptability would become her signature, the quiet weapon she would wield against nobles, foreign powers, and even her own sons. What began as a childhood of vulnerability was, in truth, the foundation of her future as one of Europe's most formidable figures. Rome's pawn, the papal chessboard. When the cannons fell silent over Florence in 1530, Catherine's life shifted once more. The Medici were restored, but the young girl's fate no longer rested in Florence. It rested in Rome, in the hands of her most powerful relative, Pope Clement VII, born Giulio de' Medici. For Clement, Catherine was not a child to be nurtured. She was a bargaining chip, a living piece on the board of European politics. Her bloodline gave her value, the last legitimate heir of Lorenzo the Magnificent's line, tied by her mother's heritage to French nobility and backed by Medici wealth. In a world where dynasties were stitched together through marriages, Catherine was worth more than gold. This was the Renaissance papacy, not the spiritual shepherd of Christendom alone, but a political machine rivaling kings and emperors. The Pope had armies, bankers, spies, and treaties at his disposal. Marriage alliances were one of his sharpest tools. By controlling Catherine's hand, Clement could tie Florence to greater powers, shield the Medici name from Republican resentment, and secure allies in the volatile balance of Europe. Historians often describe this period as one where popes thought less like priests and more like princes. Clement was no exception. He had already navigated disasters such as the sack of Rome in 1527, when imperial soldiers stormed the city, leaving it in ruins. The papacy's prestige was shaken, but Clement understood that survival depended on strategic marriages and financial maneuvering. Catherine was the perfect instrument. By 1533, he arranged her betrothal to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. On the surface, it was a glittering match. Catherine, an orphaned Florentine noble, elevated into the French royal family. But beneath the ceremony lay a dense web of geopolitics. France and the papacy had long been uneasy allies, united against the expanding power of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. By marrying Catherine into France, Clement secured the French crown's support for Medici interests in Italy. He also ensured that Florence's banking empire would remain intertwined with French fortunes. This was no union of romance, but of necessity. Catherine herself had little say. At the age of 14, she became less a bride than a treaty wrapped in silk. Here, anthropology offers a useful lens. Across cultures, marriage has often been less about affection and more about alliance. Among the Sumerians, Egyptian pharaohs, or even medieval European dynasties, daughters were given in marriage to cement bonds, secure peace, or gain territory. Catherine's marriage fits this timeless pattern. Her body and bloodline were transformed into instruments of diplomacy, her identity subsumed by the ambitions of powerful men. Yet the ceremony itself was grand. Catherine was sent across the Alps with a dowry so vast it was said to have caused inflation in Florence. She entered France, adorned in silks, accompanied by a retinue of Florentine attendants, a living reminder of the Medici's wealth and reach. Chroniclers note that her entrance dazzled French courtiers who whispered about her jewels, her gowns, and the sheer scale of her dowry. For Catherine, however, these displays were little comfort. She was a stranger in a foreign land, her future bound to a boy who barely noticed her presence. Historiography gives us two competing narratives here. One, written by her enemies, portrays Catherine as ambitious from the very beginning, scheming her way into French politics. Another, drawn from her own letters and sympathetic accounts, shows her as a girl overwhelmed by circumstances, patient rather than ambitious, shaped by necessity rather than choice. The truth likely lies in the second view. At 14, she was still more student of survival than master of manipulation. Her genius would emerge later, but the foundation was laid in these years of displacement. It is important to recognize the Vatican's role in shaping this fate. Secret society researchers often point out how the papacy functioned as a nexus of both spiritual authority and hidden influence. Popes like Clement operated within networks of bankers, cardinals, and diplomats that rivaled any secular power. Some modern conspiracy theorists even connect the Medici papacy to the idea of shadow governance, a family controlling Europe not through armies, but through finance and marriage. While such theories stretch evidence, they capture a kernel of truth. The Medici, through Catherine, embedded themselves at the heart of European power. There is also a symbolic dimension. Renaissance thinkers believed in astrology, and Catherine's marriage was interpreted in the light of celestial omens. Some claimed the alignment of planets during her journey across the Alps foretold turbulence, a queen whose reign would bring storms of blood and fire. Whether these omens were fabricated or genuinely observed, they added to the aura of destiny surrounding her. Catherine herself was already developing an acute sense of observation. Letters from her youth reveal a girl curious about the customs of France, attentive to the differences between Italian and French courtly behavior. She noticed what food was served, what clothing was worn, how nobles spoke and carried themselves. Though she was mocked as foreign, she quietly absorbed the rhythms of her new world. Like the child in the convent, she survived by watching. In retrospect, her marriage to Henry, Duke of Orleans, seemed minor at first. Henry was not the heir apparent. His older brother, Francis, was next in line to the throne. Many French nobles saw Catherine as inconsequential, her marriage unlikely to produce queenship. Some even derided the match, calling her the daughter of merchants, a jab at the Medici's banking origins. What they did not know was that fate, in its ruthless way, would soon elevate Catherine. In 1536, Francis, the heir, died suddenly of illness. Overnight, Henry became the new Dauphin of France. Catherine, once overlooked, was now consort to the future king. The girl who had been shuffled from convent to convent, threatened with death, used as a pawn by the papacy, was suddenly poised to become Queen of France. And yet, even this ascent brought new challenges. Her husband showed little affection for her. The court remained suspicious of her foreign origins. For years, she bore no children, and whispers spread that she was barren. In a world where a queen's value was measured in heirs, this was a dangerous flaw. Catherine faced ridicule, slander, and the threat of annulment. But if her childhood had taught her anything, it was that survival required patience. She had lived through sieges, rebellion, and near execution. She could endure mockery. And as history would show, she would not only endure, but she would transform these early humiliations into the seeds of a power that would outlast many of her enemies. For now, though, she remained what she had always been, a pawn on a larger chessboard. The difference was that in time she would learn how to turn the board itself. Stranger in a foreign court. When Catherine de' Medici arrived in France in 1533, she was 14 years old, a teenager crossing the Alps to a land she had never seen, carrying with her silks, jewels, and the weight of Medici expectations. Behind her trailed a dowry so immense that even seasoned French courtiers whispered about its extravagance, yet wealth could not buy her acceptance. To the French nobility she was foreign, plain, and worst of all, the daughter of bankers. France in the 16th century was a court obsessed with lineage. Bloodlines were everything. While Catherine's Medici family wielded power in Florence, many French nobles considered them nouveaux riches, merchants who had bought their way into politics, rather than warriors who had earned titles on the battlefield. This prejudice ran deep. Catherine was mocked for her Italian manners, her accent, and her style of dress. Some nobles dismissed her as the little Florentine, treating her more like an imported curiosity than the future consort of their prince. Her new husband, Henry, Duke of Orléans, barely looked at her. Reserved and melancholic, Henry had already given his heart to another, Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years his senior, renowned for her beauty, intellect, and influence. In court spectacles, Diane often appeared beside Henry as though she were his wife. She wore Catherine's colours, controlled Henry's attention, and even signed political documents. For the young Italian bride, the message was clear. She was a stranger not only in France, but in her own marriage. But Catherine had been here before, in spirit, if not in geography. As a child, she had survived exile, mockery, and the threat of death in Florence. She knew what it was to be unwanted, and as in her convent days, she adopted the strategy of observation. She did not lash out against Diane or attempt to demand Henry's attention. Instead, she quietly absorbed everything: how courtiers spoke, how alliances shifted, how power moved invisibly from hand to hand. Anthropology offers a useful insight here. When outsiders enter foreign societies, they often rely on mimicry and patience to survive. Catherine exemplified this. She studied French customs, adjusted her clothing to suit local tastes, and worked tirelessly to embody the role of a proper French consort. She may not have been adored, but she was disciplined. Her patience would later become one of her greatest strengths. Still, the early years were painful. For a decade, Catherine bore no children. In a royal court, this was not a private grief, but a public scandal. A queen without heirs was considered a failure, a defective vessel. French nobles whispered that she was barren, some suggesting her marriage should be annulled. Ambassadors speculated about sending her back to Florence. At one point, Henry's father, King Francis I, even considered dissolving the union to replace her with a more fertile bride. Historiography reveals that many of these accusations were unfair. Some medical historians argue that the problem lay not with Catherine but with Henry. Evidence suggests Henry suffered from anatomical issues that may have made conception difficult. Yet the blame, as always, fell on the woman. Catherine endured the humiliation in silence. Later, when she did bear 10 children, she reminded her critics of this injustice. But in her youth, she had no such power. During these years of exclusion, Catherine turned inward. She cultivated friendships with a small circle of loyal attendants, many of them Italians who had followed her from Florence. She wrote letters, kept accounts, and practiced the skills of household management that would later serve her in governance. But most importantly, she remembered every insult, every slight, every noble who dismissed her as irrelevant. This mental ledger of enemies and allies became the foundation of her later political strategy. The psychological impact of being sidelined cannot be underestimated. Depth psychology suggests that repeated rejection often forges either despair or resilience. In Catherine's case, it created a steely patience. She learned that power was not always seized in the moment. Sometimes it was gathered quietly, waiting for circumstances to shift. Symbolism also played a role in these years. Diane de Poitiers, her rival, adopted the crescent moon as her emblem, a symbol of chastity, mystery, and feminine authority. Catherine, meanwhile, was left without a clear symbol to represent her place at court. In Renaissance culture, symbols mattered as much as words. They communicated power in a visual language everyone understood. Catherine's lack of a symbol reflected her marginal status, but it also meant she was free to craft her own identity later, unbound by early associations. Few at the French court expected Catherine to amount to much. She was tolerated, not respected. Yet history is full of outsiders who later became central figures. In Byzantine history, Theodora rose from actress to empress, shaping imperial policy beside Justinian. In England, Eleanor of Aquitaine outmaneuvered kings and sons alike to maintain influence. Catherine fit this archetype, the underestimated woman who watches, learns, and waits for the right moment. And that moment would come sooner than expected. In 1536, Henry's elder brother Francis suddenly died of illness. Overnight, Catherine's husband became the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. Catherine, the overlooked Florentine, was now poised to be queen. The courtiers who had mocked her began to realize she was no longer a peripheral figure. Her survival instincts, honed in Florence, were about to meet the crucible of French politics. Yet her challenges were far from over. Even as Dauphine, she remained overshadowed by Diane. Henry's devotion to his mistress did not waver. Catherine's role was still marginal, her voice quiet in council, her influence limited. But she had secured her place. She was no longer a pawn to be returned or annulled. She was the future Queen of France. Historians today often overlook the significance of these early years. They see Catherine's later ruthlessness, her role in religious wars, her reputation for poison and prophecy, and forget the foundation laid in her youth. But it was precisely in these humiliations that her resilience was forged. By learning to survive as a stranger, she mastered the art of patience. By being excluded, she sharpened her observation. By being silenced, she learned to listen and to remember. Florence had taught her survival under siege. France would teach her survival in silence. Together, these lessons created the woman who would one day be known as the Black Queen. And though she did not yet realize it, Catherine's years in the shadows were not wasted. They were the slow gathering of strength, the silent weaving of a strategy. Because in royal courts, as in war, sometimes the most dangerous figure is not the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who watches, waits, and remembers. The shadow of Diane de Poitiers. If Catherine's early years in France were marked by uncertainty, they were also defined by one woman, Diane de Poitiers. To understand Catherine's rise, one must first understand the shadow Diane cast over her life. Diane was no ordinary mistress. 20 years older than Henry, she was elegant, educated, and politically astute. Unlike the fleeting lovers that filled courts across Europe, Diane occupied a unique space. She was more than a consort in secret. She was a partner in public. At tournaments and ceremonies, it was Diane who appeared at Henry's side. She signed documents, distributed patronage, and even influenced matters of state. Catherine, the lawful wife, was often relegated to the background. This arrangement was humiliating, but it was also strategic. Diane cultivated her image with precision. Her chosen emblem was the crescent moon, a symbol that conveyed chastity, mystery, and power. It was said she dressed almost exclusively in black and white, embodying the lunar iconography she had made her own. Renaissance culture was saturated with symbolism, and Diane wielded it like a weapon. Every appearance in Henry's colors, every public gesture, reinforced her dominance over the young queen. For Catherine, this was an ordeal. She could not openly challenge Diane. To do so would have meant alienating her husband further and risking her already fragile position. Instead, she chose a familiar path. patience. She watched, she endured, and she learned. In anthropology, there is a pattern known as the rival wife, a cultural phenomenon observed across societies where power is shared uneasily between a legitimate spouse and a favored consort. Often, it is the legitimate wife who appears weaker, bound by duty and tradition, while the consort exercises influence through personal intimacy. Catherine embodied this archetype, yet she also transcended it. Where others might have collapsed under the weight of public humiliation, she quietly transformed the experience into training. Her humiliation was particularly sharp in matters of inheritance. For 10 years after her marriage, Catherine bore no children. This absence gave Diane and her allies ammunition to mock her as barren. It also gave rise to dangerous rumors of annulment. French nobles whispered that Henry might set Catherine aside to marry another woman who could provide heirs. Diane herself, though never openly declaring it, seemed to relish Catherine's vulnerability. Historiography complicates this picture. Later chroniclers, particularly Protestant writers hostile to Catherine, portrayed her as consumed by jealousy toward Diane, suggesting that her later ruthlessness stemmed from this rivalry. Yet contemporary records paint a subtler portrait. Catherine was certainly wounded, but she rarely lashed out. Instead, she endured years of invisibility without open revolt. This was not weakness, but strategy. By refusing to create scandal, she preserved her position, however marginal, until circumstances turned in her favor. There is also a psychological dimension. Depth psychology tells us that rivalry often crystallizes identity. Catherine's sense of self, shaped by her childhood traumas, was further refined by Diane's dominance. To survive in a world where her rival monopolized her husband's attention, Catherine had to cultivate inner resources, resilience, calculation, and long memory. Later, when she finally gained power, she would exhibit a remarkable ability to outlast opponents. Perhaps this endurance was born in those silent years under Diane's shadow. The contrast between the two women also reveals the cultural tensions of the age. Diane represented a traditional, almost mythic form of female power. The courtesan mistress, embodying beauty, wisdom, and personal influence over a king. Catherine, by contrast, represented a new kind of female authority, dynastic, institutional, and political. Their rivalry was not merely personal, but symbolic of two competing models of power. Meanwhile, Catherine was not idle. Though excluded from Henry's affections, she invested in cultivating allies where she could. She maintained her household with care, rewarded loyalty, and built quiet networks of support. She also turned to her education. Her training in Florence, in astrology, medicine, and statecraft, gave her intellectual resources that few at the French court possessed. While Diane dazzled with beauty and charisma, Catherine prepared herself with knowledge and strategy. One of the more intriguing aspects of this period is Catherine's use of imagery. Lacking a public emblem of her own, she began to experiment with symbols that would later become associated with her: intertwined initials, astrological motifs, and geometric patterns in her commissioned works. Renaissance symbolism studies suggest that such imagery was more than decoration. It was a way of carving out identity in a world where words could be dangerous. The wider geopolitical context also shaped Catherine's predicament. Europe was in turmoil. The Reformation had fractured Christendom, setting Catholics and Protestants against each other. France itself simmered with religious tensions that would later explode into open war. Against this backdrop, Catherine's position at court was precarious. A foreign-born queen with no heirs and little influence could easily become expendable. But Catherine understood something vital. In times of chaos, those who endure long enough eventually inherit the center. Her endurance was finally rewarded. After a decade of childlessness, Catherine began to bear children, 10 in total, securing her place as mother of the next generation of French monarchs. With each child, her status grew. Though Diane remained powerful, Catherine was no longer dispensable. She was the mother of France's future, and this gave her leverage that no mistress could fully eclipse. Still, she never forgot the years of humiliation. When Henry II died in 1559 from a jousting accident, Diane was immediately dismissed from court. Catherine, now Queen Mother and Regent, made certain her rival was stripped of influence. It was not a vengeful outburst, but a quiet removal, the final act of a rivalry that had shaped Catherine's path to power. Looking back, one sees how Diane de Poitiers inadvertently prepared Catherine for the role she would play in history. By forcing her into the shadows, Diane honed her resilience. By monopolizing Henry's attention, she pushed Catherine toward patience and calculation. By humiliating her, she gave her the memory of endurance. In a strange way, Diane was both Catherine's tormentor and her teacher. This dynamic also reflects a broader theme of Renaissance politics. Power was rarely straightforward. It was layered, symbolic, and deeply tied to perception. Diane taught Catherine the importance of appearances, the theatre of influence. Catherine, in turn, learned to manipulate this theatre with greater subtlety than her rival ever could. In mythological terms, one might say Diane embodied the archetype of the moon, radiant, visible, tied to cycles of favour. Catherine, meanwhile, became the archetype of the earth, silent, enduring, shaping events from beneath. The moon may shine brighter in the moment, but the earth endures when the moon wanes, and when the moon of Diane set, Catherine's long night of patience finally began to turn toward dawn. Mother of France, 10 heirs, 10 pawns. For nearly a decade, Catherine de' Medici endured whispers of barrenness, endured humiliation at the French court, and endured the overshadowing presence of Diane de Poitiers. But in the late 1540s, everything changed. Catherine began to give birth, not once or twice, but again and again, until she had 10 children in total. In the eyes of the court, she transformed overnight from the infertile Florentine into the prolific mother of France's future. The births silenced her critics. Every child secured her position further. Every christening reminded the court that Catherine's womb had become the vault of the Valois dynasty. It was said that she turned her body into a fortress of dynastic security. In a world where power was transmitted through bloodlines, her role as mother of heirs gave her the authority no mistress could rival. But Catherine understood that children were more than blessings. They were pawns, living instruments of diplomacy. From Florence, she had inherited the Medici instinct for treating family as political capital. Now in France, she wielded that instinct with precision. Each child became a tool to secure alliances, balance factions, and extend her influence far beyond her immediate household. Her eldest son, Francis, was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, linking France to Scotland and its fragile independence against England. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was married to Philip II of Spain, placing a Medici-born queen beside the most powerful monarch of Catholic Europe. Marguerite, another daughter, was married to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince, in a union meant to bridge France's religious divide. Every child became part of her grand strategy, each marriage a treaty in flesh and blood. Historiography often notes that Catherine borrowed from the Habsburgs, who perfected the strategy of dynastic marriage. The Habsburg motto declared, "Let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry." Catherine applied this principle with equal skill, turning her children into ambassadors of French influence across Europe. Where armies drained treasuries, her daughters and sons extended influence with vows at the altar. Yet these children were not just pawns in Catherine's eyes, they were also her legacy. She had suffered too much humiliation in her early years not to value the security they represented. She guarded them fiercely, sometimes obsessively. Letters reveal her constant concern for their health, their tutors, and their companions. In an age when disease and political intrigue could snatch lives overnight, she monitored them like a strategist, protecting the future of a fragile dynasty. There is an anthropological insight here. In many cultures, motherhood is tied not only to nurturing, but to statecraft. Queens from ancient Egypt to medieval Byzantium leveraged their role as mothers to wield political influence. Catherine followed in this tradition, embodying the archetype of the Great Mother, but with a distinctly political edge. Her motherhood was not confined to the nursery. It extended to the council chamber and the battlefield, wherever her children's futures were at stake. Her prolific motherhood also carried symbolic weight. In astrology, the alignment of stars at the birth of heirs was considered an omen for dynasties. Catherine, steeped in Florentine traditions of astrology and prophecy, reportedly consulted astrologers for each child's horoscope. This was more than superstition. In a court where nobles whispered of destiny, astrology gave her a language to frame her children as divinely favored. Even skeptics could not ignore a queen who produced heirs under auspicious skies. Yet motherhood brought new challenges. Her children grew up in a fractured kingdom. France was tearing itself apart along religious lines, Catholics and Protestants locked in bloody conflict. As mother and regent, Catherine had to position each child carefully, balancing factions without losing control. It was a delicate game, and mistakes carried the weight of massacres. Catherine's letters show her awareness of this burden. She wrote to her children constantly, instructing them in politics, warning them of dangers, urging them to maintain unity. She was less a doting mother and more a general commanding her army of heirs. Her words revealed a blend of tenderness and calculation that defined her motherhood. She loved them, but she also understood they were instruments of survival for both her family and France itself. There is also a psychological layer. Depth psychology frames the archetype of the mother not only as nurturing, but as protective, sometimes even devouring. Catherine embodied this paradox. She nurtured her children, but also consumed their individuality, binding them to her strategies. Modern readers might see this as controlling, but in the context of 16th century politics, it was necessity. A divided family was a doomed dynasty. Catherine knew this, and she ruled her household with the same determination she later brought to the throne. The cultural impact of her motherhood was immense. In a Europe where many queens died young in childbirth or produced few heirs, Catherine's survival through 10 pregnancies made her exceptional. She became a symbol of fertility and endurance, qualities celebrated in court festivals and ceremonies. Yet her prolific motherhood also fueled suspicion. Protestant pamphlets accused her of using sorcery to conceive, claiming her children were unnatural. Catholic hardliners whispered that she favored her sons excessively, allowing them to grow weak. As always, Catherine's successes were interpreted by enemies as signs of corruption. Still, her motherhood gave her the foundation of power that would carry her through the coming storms. When Henry II died in 1559 from his infamous jousting accident, it was Catherine, mother of the new King Francis II, who stepped forward to guide the realm. Her years of marginalization had ended. As mother of heirs, she was now indispensable. Historians often call her the mother of France, not simply because she bore children, but because she carried the dynasty through its most perilous era. Each child was a thread woven by Catherine into a fragile net that held the monarchy together. Without her, the Valois line might have collapsed decades earlier. But there was irony in her triumph. For all her devotion, her children often proved disappointing. Francis II died young. Charles IX struggled with illness and paranoia. Henry III was flamboyant and unreliable. Daughters like Marguerite, Queen of Navarre, became symbols of scandal rather than stability. Catherine had produced heirs, but their reigns revealed the limits of even the most careful planning. She could bear children and guide them, but she could not control destiny. And yet, perhaps she knew this all along. Astrology, prophecy, and experience had taught her that fate was fickle. Her role was not to guarantee success, but to preserve survival. Through her children, she extended her influence across Europe, binding together alliances that lasted far beyond her lifetime. In the end, Catherine's motherhood was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph because it secured her position and gave France a generation of monarchs. Tragedy because those monarchs inherited a kingdom divided, where even a mother's guidance could not prevent disaster. Still in the story of Catherine de' Medici, her 10 children remain central. They were not only her heirs, but her strategy, her tools, her legacy. Each child was a move on the chessboard of Europe, carefully placed by the woman who had once been dismissed as barren. From stranger in a foreign court, Catherine had become the indispensable mother of a dynasty, and with this new power, she was ready to step into a role that went beyond motherhood: regent, strategist, and, in the eyes of many, the true ruler of France. The regent in the shadows. The summer of 1559 was meant to celebrate peace. After years of war with Spain, France marked the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis with a grand tournament in Paris. Knights in glittering armour tilted their lances before cheering crowds, and King Henry II himself entered the lists to display his prowess. What followed was not triumph, but tragedy. During a joust, the lance of Gabriel de Montgomery splintered, driving a shard through the king's eye. Within days, Henry was dead. France was thrown into crisis. The throne passed to Catherine's eldest son, Francis II, a boy of just 15. He was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, whose uncles, the powerful Guise family, quickly moved to dominate the court. The Guise brothers, staunch Catholics, seized the levers of government, sidelining rivals and consolidating authority around the young king. For Catherine, it seemed like a replay of her youth. Once again, she was at risk of being irrelevant, this time in her own son's reign. But Catherine had learned too much from the shadows to accept invisibility. She positioned herself carefully, not as a challenger to the Guises, but as the indispensable mother. She cultivated her son's trust, offering herself as a guide in the bewildering world of court politics. While Francis leaned heavily on his Guise-in-laws, Catherine quietly observed, waiting for the balance of power to shift. That shift came sooner than expected. In 1560, a conspiracy erupted, the Amboise plot. A group of Protestant nobles attempted to kidnap the king from Guy's control, hoping to free him from what they saw as Catholic tyranny. The plot failed, but it revealed the depth of religious tension tearing France apart. Protestants and Catholics alike were maneuvering for influence, and the monarchy, led by a sickly teenage king, was fragile. When Francis II died later that year from an ear infection, Catherine's opportunity arrived. Her second son, Charles IX, was only 10 years old. By law, a regent was required to govern until he reached maturity. The powerful Guise family expected to control the regency. So did Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, leader of the Protestant faction. Instead, Catherine asserted herself. She argued that as the king's mother, she alone could safeguard his throne. Remarkably, both Catholic and Protestant leaders agreed. Neither side trusted the other with full control. Catherine, positioned between them, became the compromise. Thus began her regency. For the first time, Catherine was no longer a sidelined queen or the overshadowed wife of Henry II. She was the regent of France, ruling in her son's name. The woman who had once been dismissed as barren, foreign, and irrelevant now held the fate of a kingdom in her hands. Her style of governance reflected the lessons of her life. Catherine was not a warrior queen like Isabella of Castile, nor a visionary reformer like Elizabeth I of England. Instead, she ruled through balance, patience, and survival. She did not seek to impose ideology, but to prevent collapse. France was a kingdom divided, Catholics and Protestants locked in enmity, nobles arming private armies, and towns erupting in violence. Catherine's role was less to command than to mediate. to keep the crown alive while the kingdom threatened to tear itself apart. She convened religious colloquies, inviting Catholic bishops and Protestant ministers to debate in the hope of reconciliation. The Colloquy of Poissy in 1561 was one such attempt, where the Protestant theologian Theodore Beza confronted Catholic leaders under Catherine's watchful eye. Though the debates resolved little, they symbolized her intent not to destroy one side but to preserve enough balance for her son's throne to survive. This strategy of balance mirrored patterns from ancient history. In Rome, emperors often ruled by keeping senatorial factions at odds, never allowing one to dominate. In Byzantium, empresses like Theodora had mediated between powerful court factions to stabilize imperial rule. Catherine inherited this tradition of balance, not through armies, but through political theatre, patience, and calculation. Yet her regency also revealed the limitations of such balancing. Violence was already spilling into the streets. In 1562, the massacre of Vassy, when Guy's troops slaughtered Protestant worshippers, ignited the first of France's wars of religion. Catherine found herself presiding over a kingdom fractured not just by politics, but by faith itself. Her response was pragmatic. She issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, granting Protestants limited freedom of worship. It was a radical move for a Catholic queen, but it was not born of religious sympathy. It was survival strategy. Catherine believed that without some concession, France would collapse into chaos. But the edict satisfied neither side. Catholics called her too lenient. Protestants accused her of insincerity. Here we see another dimension of Catherine's regency, her reliance on symbolism and perception. She staged royal progresses, traveling with her young son across the kingdom, showing the crown's presence in every region. These progresses were more than ceremonial. They were theatre designed to remind both Catholics and Protestants that the monarchy still stood above them all. In historiography, Catherine is often portrayed as cold and manipulative during these years. But a closer look at the records suggests something else: desperation. She was a woman caught between two fires, trying to preserve her dynasty, while both Catholic zealots and Protestant reformers threatened to engulf it. She did not have the luxury of vision. Her goal was simpler: survival. Psychology offers an interesting lens here. Catherine had lived her entire life in survival mode, as an orphan, as an unwanted bride, as a sidelined queen. Her regency was an extension of this instinct. She did not seek to conquer but to endure, to buy time for her sons to grow into their crowns. Yet endurance has its costs. By constantly balancing between factions, Catherine made herself appear untrustworthy to both. Protestants remembered her compromises, Catholics remembered her concessions, and in the end, both painted her as duplicitous. This reputation, of poison, manipulation, and shadowy power, grew from these years, even if much of it was slander born of frustration. Still, one cannot deny her effectiveness. In the most dangerous years of France's history, when a child sat on the throne and the kingdom teetered on civil war, it was Catherine who kept the monarchy alive. She did not end the wars, nor did she unite the kingdom. But she prevented total collapse, and sometimes survival itself is victory. By the time Charles IX reached his teenage years, Catherine had already carved out her place. She was no longer just the regent. She was the indispensable presence, the mother whose authority extended far beyond maternal care. She had transformed herself into the axis of the French monarchy, a position she would never fully relinquish. And those storms still gathered, storms of faith, blood, and betrayal. Catherine had proven one thing beyond doubt: she was no pawn, no forgotten bride. She was the regent in the shadows, and France would not survive without her. Between cross and crown. By the early 1560s, Catherine de' Medici stood at the heart of a kingdom splitting in two. France was no longer just a land of knights, nobles, and royal pomp. It had become a battlefield of faith. On one side stood the Catholics, led by powerful families like the Guises, demanding strict adherence to Rome. On the other, the Protestants, the Huguenots, inspired by the preaching of Calvin, and determined to reform both church and state. Between these factions, like a fragile bridge spanning a chasm, stood Catherine. Her position was not enviable. As regent for her young son Charles IX, she was expected to be the guardian of the crown. But the crown itself was caught between cross and sword. Each decision Catherine made risked alienating one side, fueling suspicion from the other. If she favoured the Catholics, the Protestants rebelled. If she granted concessions to Protestants, the Catholics called her a traitor to the faith. To be Queen Mother in such an age was to live in permanent contradiction. In 1562, the contradictions boiled into open war. The spark was struck at Vassy, where the Duke of Guise's soldiers attacked a gathering of Huguenots at worship, killing dozens. This massacre ignited the first of 8 wars of religion that would scar France for decades. Catherine, who had tried to negotiate peace through edicts of tolerance, suddenly found herself ruling a nation at war with itself. Her instinct was mediation. She issued edicts granting Protestants limited freedom of worship, hoping to quiet the flames. But these efforts often pleased no one. To Catholics, she seemed too indulgent. To Protestants, her edicts looked like empty promises. The historian Jules Michelet once remarked that Catherine sought to govern through peace, but in an age where peace was treason. Why then did Catherine persist in her balancing act? Partly because she had no other choice. Unlike rulers who commanded vast armies, Catherine lacked personal military power. She could not impose unity by force. Instead, she relied on negotiation, ceremony, and the symbolic presence of the monarchy. Her strategy was to keep the crown above the factions, even when both sides wanted to drag it down into their quarrel. In anthropology, scholars note that in times of civil war, rulers often assume the role of ritual mediators, figures who embody continuity while factions clash. Catherine fit this pattern. She staged royal progresses across the kingdom, travelling with Charles IX to remind towns and provinces that the monarchy still stood. These journeys were not just political errands, they were ritual performances, ceremonies of visibility. Every appearance of the king and queen mother was meant to reassure a fractured kingdom that the crown was not broken. Catherine also understood the power of spectacle. She organised elaborate court festivals, pageants and dances, blending Catholic and classical imagery to present the monarchy as the unifying centre of culture. Some saw this as frivolous, but it was calculated. In a time when words could divide, symbols could still unite. Through spectacle, she projected continuity even when reality was chaos. Yet beneath the glitter of festivals lay the blood of war. French towns became battlegrounds, churches were sacked, and neighbours turned on neighbours. Catherine often found herself accused of duplicity. Protestants claimed she was secretly conspiring with the Guise faction. Catholics accused her of protecting heretics. In truth, she aligned with whichever side kept the monarchy from collapse at that moment. To modern eyes, this looks like opportunism. To Catherine, it was survival. Historiography reveals how divided opinion has been on her role. 19th century historians painted her as a schemer, the Italian queen who poisoned France with intrigue. Modern scholars, however, suggest a more complex portrait. A woman trapped in impossible circumstances whose compromises were less about ambition than about preventing total disintegration. The very fact that the monarchy survived into the 1580s owes much to her balancing act. Her strategies also drew from deeper traditions. In Florence, she had learned the art of waiting, of patience under siege. In Rome, she had seen how popes played factions against each other to maintain control. Now, as Queen Mother, she applied those lessons to France. She brokered marriages between Catholic and Protestant houses, offered concessions, withdrew them when they failed, and staged rituals of unity that often masked bitter divides. One of her boldest moves came in 1572, when she arranged the marriage of her daughter Marguerite to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant leader. The idea was to unite Catholic and Protestant factions through the bond of matrimony, echoing ancient strategies where rival clans sealed peace through kinship. But the marriage, as history remembers, would become the setting for one of France's darkest tragedies, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Even before that blood-soaked event, Catherine's mediations had been criticised. Protestant leaders accused her of insincerity, noting that she seemed to shift her loyalties with the wind. Catholic hardliners accused her of betraying Rome. In truth, her approach was pragmatic. She did not believe either side could be destroyed without destroying France itself. Her goal was not victory, but equilibrium, however precarious. There is a psychological resonance here. Catherine, who had survived siege, humiliation, and exile, saw politics through the lens of survival. She knew that permanent victories rarely existed. Instead, what mattered was endurance, keeping the monarchy alive long enough to adapt to changing circumstances. Just as she had survived her childhood by patience and concealment, she now guided her dynasty through war by compromise and delay. Her reliance on astrology and prophecy during these years also deserves mention. Catherine often consulted astrologers before making political decisions, not necessarily because she believed the stars controlled events, but because astrology offered a symbolic language to frame uncertainty. In a kingdom where both Protestants and Catholics sought divine sanction for their cause, astrology provided a third language, neither strictly Catholic nor Protestant, that reinforced her image as a queen above the factions. Still, Catherine could not escape the perception of duplicity. Rumors spread that she used poison to eliminate enemies, that she dabbled in black magic, that she manipulated her sons like puppets. These stories, many exaggerated or false, stuck because they captured the unease of a kingdom where truth itself seemed elusive. Catherine became the embodiment of ambiguity, the face of survival in an age that demanded certainty. And yet, despite the accusations, despite the wars and massacres, she achieved something remarkable. She kept the monarchy alive. In an age when kings were overthrown, assassinated, or bankrupted by civil war, Catherine maintained the Valois line through 3 fragile reigns. She could not stop the bloodshed, but she prevented the crown from shattering entirely. In ancient mythology, there is the figure of the weaver, the one who holds the threads of fate together while chaos rages around. Catherine became that figure for France. Each thread was fragile, each knot temporary, but the pattern endured. She was neither saint nor sorceress, but something more difficult, a mediator in an age of absolutes. Her legacy from this period is not victory, but survival. Between cross and crown, between zeal and reform, she chose neither side fully. Instead, she chose the crown itself, the fragile symbol of continuity that might yet carry France through the storm. Perfume, poison, and the theatre of fear. In the candle-lit corridors of Renaissance France, power was rarely wielded by sword alone. Whispers, rumours, and shadows carried as much force as armies. Catherine de' Medici understood this better than anyone. To her enemies, she became the Italian queen with a cabinet of poisons, a woman who killed with scented gloves and ruled with curses. Whether these tales were true or not mattered less than the fear they inspired. Catherine's genius was that she let the legends thrive. France in the mid-16th century was already fertile ground for suspicion. The court was riven by religious conflict, foreign spies lingered at every banquet, and nobles trusted charm as little as they trusted armies. Against this backdrop, Catherine's fascination with alchemy, astrology, and perfumery seemed suspicious. She had grown up in Florence, the cradle of Renaissance science and esoterica. There, medicine, chemistry, and magic often blurred together. Physicians prescribed astrological remedies, apothecaries experimented with strange concoctions, and alchemists whispered of the philosopher's stone. Catherine carried these traditions with her to France, but in a land already steeped in paranoia, they became ammunition for scandal. One of the most enduring legends concerns her Italian perfumer Renato Bianco, better known as René the Florentine. Trained in both fragrance and chemistry, René followed Catherine to France and established her private laboratory. From this space came perfumes, scented gloves, and rare cosmetics. But rumors quickly spread that René's workshop was no mere perfumery. Instead, it was said to be a laboratory of poison. Gloves laced with arsenic, books dusted with toxins, jewelry infused with slow-acting venoms. These became staples of the gossip that followed Catherine throughout her life. The most infamous story tells of Jeanne d'Albret, the mother of Henry of Navarre, who supposedly died after receiving a pair of perfumed gloves from Catherine. Modern historians doubt this tale. Jeanne likely succumbed to illness. But the story persisted because it fit the image of Catherine as a woman who killed with elegance. What better symbol for the so-called Black Queen than poison disguised as perfume, death concealed in luxury? Alchemy was another cornerstone of her reputation. Catherine sponsored astrologers, physicians, and alchemists who promised insight into the hidden laws of nature. Her favorite astrologer, Cosimo Ruggieri, drew up charts for her children, predicted political outcomes, and became a symbol of her supposed dabbling in the occult. To contemporaries, these associations blurred the line between science and sorcery. For Protestants already eager to smear her as an enemy of reform, the presence of astrologers and alchemists at her side became proof that she consorted with dark forces. Historiography reveals how much of this was exaggeration. Catherine's interest in alchemy and astrology was not unusual for her time. Kings, queens, and even popes employed astrologers. Elizabeth I of England relied on John Dee, an alchemist and occultist. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II filled his court with astrologers and alchemists. Catherine's fascination was entirely within the norms of Renaissance culture. But because she was Italian, female, and politically powerful, her interests were interpreted not as curiosity but as menace. Depth psychology offers another perspective. Rumors of poison and sorcery reflect society's projection of fear onto powerful women. In Jungian terms, Catherine became the archetype of the dark mother, the figure both nurturing and terrifying, giver of heirs and suspected taker of life. She embodied the paradox of femininity in power, indispensable yet feared, central yet accused of working from the shadows. There is also a symbolic layer in her use of perfume. In a time when Paris stank with sewage and unwashed bodies, perfume was more than luxury. It was a form of armor. Catherine and her court entered rooms preceded by powerful scents of musk, amber, and citrus. These fragrances announced presence, commanded attention, and concealed vulnerability. But to her enemies, scent became a metaphor for deception. What smelled sweet might conceal death. In this way, Catherine's perfumes became symbols of suspicion, her very presence a theatre of fear. The flying squadron, her circle of witty, beautiful ladies-in-waiting, further amplified this aura. Tasked with charming and observing powerful men, they were accused of being agents of seduction and espionage. Whether they actually gathered intelligence or simply embodied courtly elegance, their reputation added to Catherine's mystique. Imagine the gossip. A nobleman shares secrets over wine with a duchess, only to wonder later if every word had been carried back to the Queen Mother. Fear, once planted, did the rest. Anthropology helps us understand why these fears thrived. Across cultures, societies in crisis often accuse outsiders or women of secret powers. In medieval Europe, witches were blamed for plagues, failed harvests, and political unrest. In Catherine's France, where Protestants and Catholics alike sought scapegoats for war and instability, the foreign queen with a laboratory and an astrologer was an easy target. Yet Catherine did not silence these rumours. Instead, she cultivated ambiguity. She never publicly denied her interest in astrology. She never dismissed her Italian perfumer. She let the stories circulate because fear itself was a kind of power. To cross a queen rumoured to kill with gloves was to risk a fate too terrifying to imagine. Whether or not Catherine ever poisoned a soul, the suspicion alone kept enemies cautious. There is an echo here of ancient strategies. In Mesopotamia, kings cultivated myths of divine wrath to discourage rebellion. In Egypt, pharaohs cloaked themselves in the aura of gods to keep subjects in awe. Catherine, consciously or not, played a similar game. She allowed myth to intertwine with reality, using reputation as a weapon sharper than any blade. Historians today attempt to peel back these layers of myth. Most agree that Catherine was not the poison-wielding sorceress her enemies painted her to be. She was pragmatic, cautious, and far more interested in political survival than occult experiments. But the legends endure because they capture something essential. Catherine understood that in politics, perception is power. It mattered less what she actually did than what people believed she was capable of doing. By the late 1560s, Catherine's aura of fear had become inseparable from her identity. To Catholics, she was the mother of kings, guardian of tradition. To Protestants, she was the Black Queen, a foreign sorceress poisoning France. Both images were exaggerations, but both served her. They kept her central, unavoidable, and always underestimated at peril. Perfume, poison, prophecy. These were not just tools of scandal, they were the elements of a theatre Catherine staged around herself. A theatre where every scent, every rumour, every whispered story reinforced her power. France may have been divided by faith, but in its courts and corridors there was one certainty. Catherine de' Medici was not to be crossed. Superstitions, omens, and medieval echoes. In the France of Catherine de' Medici, politics was never just politics. Every decision, every alliance, every battle seemed bound to forces beyond human control. People read meaning in the flight of birds, the alignment of stars, the sudden appearance of a comet. Catherine, steeped in the traditions of both medieval superstition and Renaissance astrology, lived in a world where the boundary between fate and strategy blurred until it was nearly invisible. From her youth in Florence, she had been taught that the cosmos was a language, and that wise rulers could read its signs. Astrologers mapped her children's horoscopes, alchemists advised on auspicious days for ceremonies. Even her letters occasionally reveal the language of omens. To Catherine, these practices were not irrational. They were tools of survival, part of a cultural inheritance stretching back to Rome and beyond. Medieval Europe had long been governed by such thinking. Kings delayed coronations if eclipses darkened the sky. Battles were postponed because comets appeared, seen as heralds of doom. Farmers refused to sow fields until saints' days aligned with the moon's cycle. These were not curiosities, but part of the fabric of life. Catherine, raised amid siege and uncertainty, understood that ignoring such beliefs could alienate subjects who saw the hand of God or the devil in every unusual event. One striking example of Catherine's reliance on omens came in the mid-1560s, when the appearance of a blazing comet over Paris caused widespread panic. Chroniclers record nobles whispering of divine judgment and peasants refusing to travel at night. Catherine's response was pragmatic. She consulted her astrologers, then staged ceremonies to reassure the court. By acknowledging the omen rather than dismissing it, she preserved her authority in a society where rulers who ignored the heavens risked appearing reckless. Superstition extended beyond the stars. Everyday rituals shaped the rhythm of court and country. It was considered bad luck to cross knives on a table, to spill salt without immediately tossing a pinch over the shoulder, or to leave shoes upside down. Weddings brimmed with symbolism. Brides carried charms to ward off infertility, while processions avoided unlucky numbers. Death, too, was ritualized. Mirrors were covered to prevent spirits from becoming trapped. Bells were rung to drive away demons, and mourners wore black not only as custom, but as protection against wandering souls. Catherine moved easily within this landscape. She understood that politics was not only negotiated in treaties and councils, but also in rituals and symbols. By honoring these traditions, she reinforced her legitimacy in the eyes of a deeply superstitious people. Anthropology helps explain this dynamic. In societies undergoing crisis, superstition often flourishes as a way of managing uncertainty. France in the 16th century was a land in turmoil. Religious wars, outbreaks of plague, and famines unsettled daily life. Superstition offered a sense of order, a way to explain chaos. Catherine, who had lived her whole life in survival mode, instinctively understood the power of belief. Her reliance on omens also echoes ancient practices. Roman generals carried augurs to interpret the entrails of animals before battles. Babylonian kings consulted star charts before building temples. In medieval Europe, trial by ordeal, plunging a hand into boiling water or carrying hot iron, was justified as divine judgment. Catherine inherited this entire tradition. She did not see herself as dabbling in irrationality, but as continuing a lineage of rulers who sought cosmic approval for their decisions. Some of the superstitions Catherine embraced still survive in subtle forms today. The fear of Friday the 13th, for instance, has medieval roots in the Last Supper and the Crucifixion, and was reinforced by the suppression of the Knights Templar on October 13, 1307. Catherine's court would have been steeped in this unease around numbers. Similarly, the belief in charms for protection, horseshoes, lucky coins, rabbit's feet, echo the talismans worn at her court to ward off misfortune. Even the practice of covering mirrors after death remains in some European households today, a lingering echo of the medieval belief that souls could be trapped in glass. Historiography reveals how these superstitions were not marginal, but central to governance. Chroniclers frequently recorded omens as part of political history: eclipses before battles, strange births before plagues, sudden storms before royal deaths. Catherine's own reign was bookended by such events, interpreted as signs of divine favor or condemnation. Her enemies used these omens against her, claiming disasters proved she was cursed. Her allies sought favorable signs to prove she was chosen. Psychology also offers an insight here. Carl Jung wrote of the collective unconscious, the deep reservoir of symbols and archetypes shared across cultures. Catherine's world was saturated with these archetypes: the queen as sorceress, the comet as harbinger, the poisoned glove as symbol of treachery. Whether or not these things were real mattered less than the fact that they resonated in the collective imagination. Catherine wielded them not as delusions, but as instruments of influence. Take, for example, her association with Nostradamus. When she invited him to court, she was not merely indulging in prophecy, she was staging theatre. Nostradamus was already famous for his cryptic predictions. His presence lent Catherine an aura of mystery, as if she were in touch with knowledge beyond the ordinary. Whether or not she believed every word mattered less than the perception it created. In a kingdom fractured by doubt, to appear guided by destiny was power in itself. What made Catherine remarkable was not that she lived in a superstitious age, but that she weaponized it. She did not merely consult astrologers in secret, she staged their presence publicly. She did not dismiss omens as nonsense, she acknowledged them, reinforcing her role as interpreter between heaven and earth. This was political theatre at its most effective because it spoke the language her people already believed in. Today it is tempting to dismiss these practices as relics of a credulous age, But superstition lingers even in modern Europe. People still hesitate to walk under ladders, still fear breaking mirrors, still knock on wood to ward off misfortune. These echoes remind us that Catherine's world is not as distant as it seems. The human need for symbols, omens, and rituals has never disappeared. It has simply adapted to new forms. For Catherine, these practices were not optional. They were survival. In a court that distrusted her as foreign, in a kingdom fractured by religion, in a family of fragile sons, she found power in the unseen, in omens, rituals, and superstitions that bound the visible to the invisible. And in doing so, she created a legacy not just of politics but of myth, a queen mother who read the stars, who watched the skies for signs, who cloaked herself in the rituals of medieval superstition while guiding France through the fire of modern war. Echoes of medieval superstitions in the 21st century. It is easy to imagine Catherine de' Medici's court as an alien world, one of astrologers whispering secrets, nobles clutching talismans, and comets treated as messages from heaven. Yet, what is most surprising is not how strange her world seems, but how familiar it still is. The superstitions that guided Catherine's decisions, the omens that haunted her court, and the rituals that shaped her kingdom have not disappeared. They have simply changed costume, hiding themselves in the fabric of modern life. Take numbers, for example. Catherine lived in a culture where the number 13 was feared, linked to the betrayal of Judas at the Last Supper and to the suppression of the Knights Templar on Friday the 13th, 1307. Today, the same unease lingers. Hotels in Europe still skip the 13th floor, airplanes omit row 13, and many travelers quietly adjust their plans to avoid that date. What Catherine's courtiers whispered about at banquets, we now book around on our calendars. Mirrors, too, remain charged with unease. In the 16th century, mirrors were covered after death to prevent souls from becoming trapped, a belief Catherine would have recognized from both Italian and French traditions. In some European households today, the practice endures, framed as respect for the dead rather than fear of spirits. And the modern superstition of 7 years bad luck for breaking a mirror is a direct descendant of Renaissance, fears that reflective glass could fracture the soul itself. Astrology, once the preserve of Catherine's court astrologers like Cosimo Ruggieri, is now downloaded on smartphones. Where Ruggieri drew charts for royal births, millions today consult horoscopes through apps, blogs, and social media. The language has shifted from planetary conjunctions dictating royal marriages to zodiac memes predicting your week. But the impulse is the same. People still crave meaning in the stars, a reminder that human uncertainty has always sought guidance from the heavens. Even Catherine's fascination with perfumes as both protection and danger finds echoes in the present. Renaissance courtiers wore scented lockets, believing aromas warded off plague and evil spirits. Today, essential oils and aromatherapy are marketed as wellness tools, promising calm, protection, or even healing. The link between scent and unseen forces, between fragrance and fate, has never truly vanished. Weddings remain particularly rich with superstition, many inherited directly from Catherine's age. The custom of carrying something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, has medieval roots in charms meant to ward off infertility and misfortune. Throwing rice at newlyweds evolved from fertility rituals tied to the cycles of crops. Even the taboo against seeing the bride before the wedding was once grounded in fears of curses and evil eyes. Catherine, who arranged dynastic marriages as matters of state, would have recognized these rituals instantly. Death, too, remains ritualized in ways Catherine would have understood. Bells were once rung to drive away spirits. Today, church bells still toll in mourning, even if their original purpose is forgotten. Black clothing as a symbol of grief began as protection against wandering souls. It remains standard at funerals worldwide. What was once seen as spiritual defense is now called tradition. Anthropology teaches us that superstition is less about ignorance than about coping with uncertainty. Catherine's world was full of uncertainty: plague, assassination, religious war. Ours is no less unstable, though our dangers take different shapes: economic collapse, climate crisis, technological upheaval. And so we carry our own rituals. Athletes refuse to change socks before a game. Business people avoid signing contracts on unlucky days. Travelers toss coins into fountains for safe return. The stage is different, but the human instinct is identical. Depth psychology adds another layer. Carl Jung argued that superstitions survive because they speak to archetypes buried in the collective unconscious. The trickster, the death omen, the lucky charm. Catherine's court projected these archetypes onto comets, charms, and perfumes. We project them onto numbers, daily rituals, and digital horoscopes. What changes is the symbol, not the underlying need. Historiography also reminds us that what we call superstition was once considered legitimate knowledge. Astrology and medicine were intertwined. Alchemy was seen as a forerunner of chemistry. Catherine's astrologers were not charlatans in their own time, but respected advisors. In a sense, when we consult horoscopes or knock on wood, we are continuing traditions that once guided kings and queens. Even conspiracy theories echo Catherine's age. Protestants accused her of orchestrating secret massacres. Catholics suspected her of colluding with heretics. Today, whispers of shadow governments, hidden elites, and coded prophecies circulate with equal fervor. The same need to explain chaos by imagining hidden hands persists. Catherine's enemies painted her as a sorceress. Modern society paints billionaires, politicians, or secret societies in similar roles. Some of these echoes are almost uncanny. Catherine's rumoured poisoned gloves live on in modern urban legends about poisoned perfumes, cursed cosmetics, or lethal phone calls. Her reliance on astrologers finds its mirror in politicians quietly consulting image consultants and futurists. Her staging of omens as political theatre is echoed in how leaders today use symbolism, flags, rituals, slogans, to project authority beyond policy. What this reveals is continuity. The superstitions Catherine lived by, the omens she read, the rituals she performed were not abandoned by history. They shifted, adapted, survived. A comet may no longer terrify a capital, but millions still search the skies for meaning. Perfume may not be feared as poison, but we still trust scents to protect or transform us. Numbers, charms, rituals, and omens still guide our lives, often unacknowledged. In this sense, Catherine de' Medici's world is closer to ours than we think. She lived in an age when uncertainty was constant, when faith and doubt collided daily, when survival required both calculation and belief in unseen forces. So do we. The superstition that lingers in our gestures and habits is not a relic of ignorance. It is proof that human beings, whether in 16th century palaces or 21st century cities, still seek order in chaos, meaning in chance, and protection in ritual. And perhaps Catherine knew this better than most. She did not dismiss superstition as folly. She embraced it, shaped it, wielded it. She understood that power was not just political but symbolic, not just in armies but in omens. That insight is why her influence has never entirely faded. Because when we toss a coin into a fountain, when we hesitate on Friday the 13th, when we check our horoscope before a decision, we are not so far from Catherine's court, after all. Her world still lingers in ours, whispering through habits we barely notice, a reminder that superstition is not the past. It is the shadow that walks with us still, the legacy of fear and power. History often remembers Catherine de' Medici as a shadowy figure, the Italian queen mother who poisoned rivals, staged massacres, and whispered to astrologers in darkened halls. But when we strip away the propaganda of her enemies and the myths that clung to her name, what emerges is both more human and more unsettling. Catherine was neither saint nor sorceress. She was a survivor in an age that devoured the weak, a woman who transformed humiliation into strategy, motherhood into statecraft, and superstition into political theatre. Her reign as Queen Mother stretched across the lives of 3 French kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. Each too fragile, too young, or too distracted to rule effectively. In their weakness, Catherine became the strength of the monarchy. She negotiated treaties, staged marriages, organized festivals, and balanced the fury of Catholics and Protestants. Without her, the Valois dynasty would likely have crumbled decades earlier. Yet her very success became the soil of her legend. In a society unwilling to accept a woman wielding power openly, her influence had to be explained in darker terms. Thus was born the image of the poisoner, the witch, the Black Queen. Historiography reminds us that much of Catherine's dark reputation was cultivated by her Protestant enemies. Pamphlets circulated depicting her as a new Jezebel, orchestrator of massacres and puppet master of kings. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and beyond, cemented this image. While the exact extent of her involvement remains debated, Catherine bore the blame in the popular imagination. To Protestants, she became the face of Catholic cruelty. To Catholics, she was often too lenient, suspected of compromising with heretics. She lived in the impossible space between both camps and thus earned the hatred of both. Yet, modern scholars point to a different picture. Catherine was pragmatic rather than ruthless, more cautious than cruel. She relied on compromise because she had no other option. France was too divided to be ruled by force alone. Her reliance on astrologers, her fascination with omens, her sponsorship of perfumers and alchemists, all were part of the intellectual and cultural world of the Renaissance, not proof of sorcery. Her reputation as a poisoner endures not because evidence confirms it, but because her enemies needed it to explain her survival. In a patriarchal world, a woman who held power must have done so by unnatural means. Still, the legends are not meaningless. They reveal the psychology of her age. Depth psychology shows us how Catherine became an archetype, the dark mother, the woman both feared and needed, the figure who gives life and, in rumor at least, takes it away. She became a vessel for the collective anxieties of her people. In a land riven by war, famine, and plague, her presence embodied both continuity and menace. The Queen Mother, dressed in black, reading the stars, she became less a person than a symbol of survival itself. Anthropology also explains why her story lingers. Every society creates figures of fear to manage chaos. In medieval Europe, witches were blamed for failed harvests. In Renaissance France, Catherine became the scapegoat for civil war. Yet scapegoats are also indispensable. By projecting fear onto her, France preserved the monarchy itself. Catherine carried that burden whether she wanted it or not, and yet beneath the superstition, Catherine left undeniable cultural legacies. She introduced forks to the French table, popularized Italian cuisine, and sponsored court entertainments that evolved into ballet. She cultivated gardens, commissioned architecture, and transformed the French court into a stage of elegance and ritual. Even in the midst of bloodshed, she believed in the power of beauty, spectacle, and culture to hold a fractured kingdom together. Her life also illustrates the enduring power of superstition in politics. She did not dismiss omens, she staged them. She did not silence rumors, she let them fester. She understood that belief itself is a kind of currency, one that can be spent to command loyalty, inspire fear, or enforce obedience. This is why Catherine still feels strangely modern. In an age when conspiracy theories spread online, when symbols still sway elections, when fear is still weaponized in politics, her strategies remain recognizable. The tools have changed, but the psychology is the same. There is a controversial truth at the heart of Catherine's story. For all the accusations of cruelty and manipulation, she may have been the only figure who truly understood what France needed in its moment of collapse: survival above all else. She did not unify France, she did not end its wars, but she prevented the monarchy from vanishing in the firestorm of religious conflict. Her legacy is not one of peace or glory, but of endurance. And perhaps that is why her story continues to fascinate. Catherine de' Medici forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power. That survival often requires compromise, that legitimacy often depends on symbols as much as armies, that superstition, ritual, and fear can be as decisive as law or theology, and that women in power, whether in the 16th century or today, are still judged by standards different from men, accused of sorcery for skills that would be called genius in a king. As she lay dying in 1589 at the age of 69, Catherine is said to have remarked, "At least I leave no debts." It was a modest statement for a woman who had carried the weight of France on her shoulders. Yet in another sense, she left debts that still remain, debts of myth, of memory, of unresolved judgment. Was she the savior of France or its poisoner, a patient strategist or ruthless manipulator, a mother of kings or a mother of massacres? The answer, perhaps, is that she was all of these and none of them. She was human, shaped by fear, survival, and circumstance. And like all figures who wield power in chaotic times, she became larger than life, her story blending into myth until the truth itself became elusive. Today, when we hesitate on Friday the 13th, when we knock on wood, when we check horoscopes or fear hidden elites pulling strings, we are not far from Catherine's France. Her world lingers in ours, whispering through rituals we barely notice. She remains not just a queen mother of the 16th century, but a reminder that fear, superstition, and survival are timeless companions of power. History remembers her as a mother of kings, but in the shadows, she became something else. The embodiment of Europe's darkest anxieties and proof that sometimes survival itself is the most dangerous legacy of all.